settling in, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items. Thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to have you all here and be back in Zoom meeting mode instead of Zoom webinar mode. It feels much more friendly to have a whole bunch of folks around. So anyway, just so you know, we'd like you to stay muted. You're also welcome to mute your video. Well, actually, I guess we're recording this, and we want to make sure we do highlight Jim. But so keep your audio off. But you are very welcome to submit questions through chat at any time. He's happy to take questions throughout his presentation, and then we'll all pass them along to him. And if we need clarification on the chat question, we can always unmute you to join verbally. So as I mentioned, this is going to be recorded, and the slides and video will be posted shortly after this is over. I just want to tell you a little bit about the Science Gateways Community Institute, which brings you this webinar. The Science Gateways Community Institute is funded by the National Science Foundation to provide support for gateways, and we are providing that service in 3 major areas. The first area is support for building and running gateways. And that includes hands-on development support and the consultants that have specialized expertise associated with doing gateways, such as the Trusted CI folks who are doing this report that we're going to hear about today. We also have a catalog, so you can list your catalog in that. List your gateway or software in that catalog. Sorry, I'm not getting my words straight here today. But anyway, next, we have also a lot of education and training programs. This webinar series is part of that, but we also have a program called Gateway Focus Week. This includes a kind of a rip-roaring ride through all the kinds of issues that are important to consider when building a gateway, such as audience and market niche and sustainability and business planning and so forth. We also have a number of student-focused programs, which includes an intern program. And the interns now are available not just during summer, but also for during the academic year. So if you're interested in that, check out our website. You can apply to be a host, or if you know a student you think might be a good fit, you can also refer them. And of course, our website has all sorts of useful content. And finally, we have a number of events that are focused around networking and the community. And the upcoming in just less than a week now is our annual conference that includes a variety of different kinds of programs, including tutorials. Including a tutorial featuring some Trusted CI folks. We have a community forum, which is a mailing list that you can join. It's a Google group, and it's there so that people can pose questions to each other and get advice. We have 2 ambassadors programs, one focused at getting word out about gateways and how awesome they are to the scientific communities that may be unfamiliar with them, whereas the other, that's called the Science Ambassadors Program. And then our Gateway Ambassadors Program is more like people acting as sort of as an ambassador to let people on their campus understand where they can get support and information more about building gateways. And finally, we have a partner and affiliates program, which you can learn more about on our website to kind of co-promote and share resources and referrals. So with that, I'm just going to make one final plea, which is we do have a short, very, very short feedback form that we welcome your input in. We use it both to just know how you liked this webinar, but also to get ideas for future webinars. So it's just a couple of short questions. So I will post this link in the chat area partway through this program, and you can if you have to leave early, you can certainly click through to have a look at that and give us some feedback. So with that, I'm going to pass along to Jim Basney to share his screen and present to you. So I'm really delighted that he could do this at a time that is convenient for him to get feedback, because his working group has been compiling this information, and I think it'll be, I hope that this session will be a great opportunity for people to chime in with comments and questions, as well as suggest any other directions things might go. So with that, take it away.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And yeah, thanks for this opportunity to present the work of the Trustworthy Data Working Group. And so this is a collaboration of participants from many projects, all with their logos listed at the bottom of this screen here. And all my co-authors are listed here on the title screen. And so quite a few of them are here today. So I hope we do have a real good discussion about the work of the working group and get some good feedback from the community. So Terry says my mic is a little low. Let me check. Yeah, I think I'm at full volume here. So I'm just going to make sure that
I can hear Jim okay. So you I don't know why you can't hear him, Terry.
Okay. Yep. Sorry, I do have my mic cranked all the way up. So thanks for the check. Okay. So okay. So I hope you can all turn up your volume so you can hear me okay. But I'll stay close to the microphone. And I'll try and talk loud. So, the working group, we've been working since January of 2020. And so I'll be presenting the results of a survey that we've done, and then a guidance report that we've worked on together. So the goal of the Trustworthy Working Group is to provide guidance on data security for open science, with the goal of improving scientific productivity and trust in scientific results. So understanding that open science relies on data integrity and collaboration and other resources. And so the cybersecurity around that scientific data is really important for the trustworthiness of the data and the scientific results that are used to produce the data that's used to produce those scientific results. So in the working group, we had the goals to survey science projects about their current work related to trustworthy data and current opinions about trustworthy data, understand the spectrum of their data security concerns, understand their current practices so that we can share good practices that are working well in our guidance report, and then produce broadly applicable security guidance for the community. So how does this apply to science gateways? Well, I think trustworthy data is a real important topic for science gateways. Science gateways support computing on data, discovering data, moving data, accessing data repositories, visualizing data, etc. So data is, of course, very important to science gateways. And I think trustworthiness of the environment that science gateways provide, and especially the data that science gateways use is an important attribute. And so when we think about trustworthiness, I'm going to talk quite a bit about attributes of trustworthiness. And so I hope to get some feedback from you all about what attributes of trustworthiness that science gateway users expect, and what capabilities for managing trustworthiness do science gateways provide. So I thought, so there's 524 gateways in the Science Gateway catalog. How many of them deal with data? Well, so if I search for data, 524 come up. So I guess that's not a surprise, of course. Data is important to all aspects of science, and we all care about our data. So in this webinar, I'll talk about the survey, and I'll pause for some discussion around the survey, and then I'll talk about the guidance report that the working group has produced, and then I'll have some questions for open discussion about science gateways and trustworthy data. So jumping right into the survey, To develop this survey, we brainstormed about goals of the survey and what questions we would ask in the survey. And we wanted to make sure to understand prior work, prior surveys around data security, data trustworthiness, and also prior publications on the topic. So that included looking at NIST 1825 and NIST 1826 that look at trustworthiness, especially focused on data integrity. And we also looked at some examples of failures in trustworthiness of the scientific process, and is particularly related to data management and how data is processed. So there's an example of a widely used script in nuclear magnetic resonance that was that impacted results in multiple publications. And also there's some nice work from the Pegasus Scientific Workflow Integrity project that analyzed some data integrity results from computing on Open Science Grid. So those are examples of input to our discussions as we were developing the survey. So we wanted to identify concerns of researchers and operators with respect to the trustworthiness of the scientific data that they produce and use and support, understand how they define trustworthiness, and see if there's any correlations between the roles of different researchers and their concerns about data trustworthiness, look at tools and processes that researchers use to maintain data trustworthiness and understand any shortcomings, and identify opportunities for guidance. We had 4 sections in our survey that included 16 survey questions plus 4 wrap-up questions. So we gathered some respondent demographics, information about respondent data and views on trustworthiness. We had a section on the tools and technologies, and then wrap-up questions. So that included 7 multiple choice questions where you could select multiple responses, 5 Likert scale questions that went from strongly disagree to strongly agree for different statements, and then 4 free form responses. So we did receive 111 responses from when we opened the survey on April 21st of this year to when we closed it on May 31st of this year. And I think there was an SGCI blog post about it, and I think the Science Gateway community was especially really helpful in getting the word out and helping to give us some responses on the survey. So the first question we asked was about a primary job title of the respondent, and that was a free text field. And so we looked across the responses and found some keywords in those responses that occurred in multiple times. So research was the top keyword, but scientist, professor, manager, cyber infrastructure were also keywords that we saw in the job titles. But then we asked about roles, job roles, even if they don't correspond to the job title. And here we see that over 54% of the respondents selected the role of research computing facilitator, and 46% selected infrastructure provider or operator. And so, and you see these, if you add up these percentages, you see multiple respondents were selecting multiple roles, because of course, many of us have multiple roles in our different projects. I note also cybersecurity analyst and engineer was represented there, 20% represented. And we had some write-in responses, data curator, data manager, administrator, and researcher. And so here, each of these slides will include the N equals at the bottom to show how many of the respondents answered each of these questions. So in this case, all but one of the respondents provided a response to this question. So I tend to think of Science Gateway operators as mostly fitting under the infrastructure provider operator role, but interested in any feedback on that. And so then, since we have many respondents that are research facilitators, cyber infrastructure operators, then they're supporting many fields of science. And so again, we had quite a few respondents selecting multiple fields of science, with 49% selecting computer and information sciences, 44% selecting biological and environmental sciences. But of note is that, for example, social and behavioral sciences are less represented in our survey responses. Economics sciences down to 11%. So in part, as I show more of the responses of the survey questions, you can keep in mind these different areas of science that are represented here. And most of our respondents affiliated with academia, although there was overlap and also some industry representation. I think many cases will have cyber infrastructure providers that support industry and academic uses. And so they'll be working with different sectors. But also in considering the response, it's good to understand that we're mostly taking an academic view of trustworthy data. And so here's our question about attributes of data attributes of trustworthy data. And so I want to spend a bit of time and get some feedback on these attributes. So you see here the two most popular attributes were integrity and reproducibility. And I'll show on the next slide the exact definition that we provided for those attributes. But also provenance, methodology, responsible stewardship had over 70% responses. We proposed an attribute we called significance that had a pretty low response, and reputation was only around 55%. And so after the survey, we discussed adjusting our attributes in the guidance report, you'll see that we replaced these attributes. So this is the initial set of attributes that we started with in the survey. And so I'm really interested in your comments on these. So we had, so we saw the top ones were integrity and reproducibility. So integrity, the data has not been altered. And reproducibility, the data can be recreated or the associated scientific results are replicable. But also the data was generated by a credible or trusted source, that's reputation, responsible stewardship, the ownership of the data is well managed and can be responsibly transferred. And the significance was the one that was selected at the lowest rate. The data enables future research directions with associated funding and support. And so I think I also skipped over accuracy. The data is free from error, and methodology, the processes and inputs used to create the data are well established and accepted by the community. So please keep these attributes in mind and think about, when you think about trustworthy data and the security of your data, are these the attributes that match the requirements that you see from your Science Gateway users, or are there other attributes? I'm interested in your thoughts there. And so here's the first Likert scale question. Do you agree that protecting the trustworthiness of scientific data is important? And so the good news is that, let's see, let's add this up, 90%, 90% agree. Only 9% here disagree with the importance of scientific data, trustworthiness of scientific data. So it's good that we're working in an area that a vast majority agree is an important aspect of the scientific process. And so then we asked this question about who is responsible for trustworthiness of scientific data. And in part, we had the suspicion that people might think that trustworthiness of scientific data is someone else's problem. But in fact, we had a nice majority agreeing or strongly agreeing that they have some responsibility for establishing and maintaining the trustworthiness of scientific data. And that might include, well, that does include the cyber infrastructure providers that responded to the survey. And next we asked, are you confident in the trustworthiness of the scientific data that you use and produce and curate? And so again, here we have a majority being confident. And so that's good. We want to be confident in the trustworthiness of the scientific process. And so it's good to hear that the respondents have a good level of confidence. But we do have some potential room for improvement here, neither agree nor disagree. And so getting into different aspects of the requirements on trustworthy data. One aspect is working with sensitive data. And so over 50% of respondents said that they worked with personally identified data or controlled unclassified information or private health information, protected in health information. And and here's the breakdown. And so quite a few were working with multiple categories of sensitive data. And then in many cases, regulations apply to that sensitive data. So again, over 50% are working with regulated data. And so HIPAA for health data, GDPR for personal data, et cetera. And so what tools are people using to manage the security and trustworthiness of their data? Access controls and privilege escalation was the most popular option, but so archival data storage, file system, replication, backups are all about making sure that the data is available and you've got good data integrity, the data is not lost. Secure network controls, multi-factor authentication, physical security protections are about making sure the data is there's not unauthorized modifications to the data. And so these tools are getting at those attributes that we saw before. Especially, I like to see the high percentage use of multi-factor authentication. I think that's a growing, definitely seeing growing use in our community. And so I see Megan asks, did we define archival data storage within the survey? And the answer is we didn't define it in the survey, but we did define it in our follow-up guidance report. And so I can show that definition later when I get to the guidance report section. And so in part, we were relying on the survey respondents to make their best interpretation of these labels. So we asked another Likert scale question about are the tools and technologies that are protecting your research data sufficient to provide assurance against unauthorized changes and our reputational attacks. And so again, we're getting a majority agreeing and strongly agreeing with that, although less strongly agreeing than we saw in some of our other questions. And so it's good news, but potentially some room for improvement here also about the tools that we use to protect our data. And so next we asked, if you were provided with additional guidance, resources, or support, would you apply it? And so in part, this is asking the community, is it worthwhile for the working group to develop guidance? And so we did see here a majority saying yes, and also a large percentage saying maybe. And so this was good motivation for us to work on providing some guidance around trustworthy data for the community. We also asked some free text questions about why protecting the trustworthiness of scientific data is important. What are potential consequences to using data that's not trustworthy? Are there any specific tools or technologies that we would like to use or that you would like to have guidance in using? And is there anything else related to trustworthy data that you'd like us to know? And so two of the working group members, Jenna and Jeanette, went through all of those open text responses and did a qualitative analysis looking for keywords and themes. And they matched up their analysis so that to make sure that they were identifying consistent keywords and themes. And so I'm going to highlight three of them. The first is that 44 respondents identified that the impact on scientific results was really a key aspect of why data trustworthiness is important. You don't want bad data causing the research to generate bad conclusions or wrong conclusions. Also, impacts on trustworthy data faults can include reputational risk or reputational harm to the scientist or the institution. And so that was indicated in 27 of the responses. And I'll also note that only a few responses talked about security restrictions are difficult to work with, too cumbersome to follow. That was pretty good news for me, being a cybersecurity guy, that we're not making it too difficult to work with the security tools that people are currently using to manage their data. And so let me pause, before I move on to guidance, let me pause there and see if there's any other questions or comments related to the survey.
I know you're paying attention to chat well enough. You've seen them come in. I'll just add, just because you asked for feedback about this, when you had the demographics about what kinds of jobs people had, and you were suggesting that the folks who were cyber infrastructure providers and operators as being the primary gateway folks, I would imagine that some of those people would also, I mean, in that category would be a lot of research computing infrastructure providers on campuses, so they wouldn't necessarily be gateway creators, but I would think that also represented in here might be the research software engineers who would be developing gateways, and then some of these scientific data creators and users would probably identify themselves as such if they're people who are creating gateways that are, whose primary purpose is data. They're often seen in as a I mean, they're a conduit, but they're providing some kind of curatorial process essentially. So I would actually imagine that your gateways people are probably spread throughout a number of these categories, and even educators in some cases are people who have gateways. So yeah, I would definitely, I mean, I don't know if you're going to make any comments about that inside the report itself, but in terms of thinking about what kinds of jobs or projects they may be creating, that would be something I would think would be actually more diffuse.
Great. Right, I mean, over 200 science gateways. The science gateways are diverse. Some of them are the gateways built around a single data set or data archive. In other cases, it's data that the researchers are bringing to the gateway. And so I agree that science gateways don't all fit into and science gateway operators don't all fit into a single category for sure. So that's,
yeah,
I appreciate that diversity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't see any other questions have come in.
Okay, then
So
I'm going to press on, but please do keep those survey responses in mind. So, then once we analyzed those survey responses, we started working on guidance for the community. And so one aspect we wanted to look at is, well, what are the barriers or challenges to trustworthy data? And so in the survey responses, we saw that not everyone agreed on a common definition for trustworthiness, and not everyone, although many did agree that they had responsibility for trustworthiness. There was definitely different roles that are responsible for different aspects of trustworthiness. So that's an area where we provide guidance. We did have some comments about if cybersecurity requires you to patch your systems all the time, then that may impact reproducibility. Accidental failures can also have big impacts on trustworthiness. And so we shouldn't just think about malicious attacks, but think about also accidental faults. Lack of funding and incentives for supporting data can cause us to potentially cut corners. And and also perceived data quality issues can also impact trustworthiness. And so how do you demonstrate the quality of the data that you're working with? That's an important consideration. So trying to provide guidance for different people in different roles, we wanted to identify different stakeholders. And so we had the different roles in the survey here. And so we distilled them down into 4 stakeholders: data user, data provider, secure infrastructure provider, and facilitation and compliance professional. And so these are the users who work with data and research, users that data providers that are providing the data have the authority to make it available to others. There's infrastructure providers that can include the gateway operators are supplying services around the data is used, but also the gateway may be the data provider. And then often your gateway may be working with compliance officer to make sure that the data compliance requirements that your gateway works with are supported, and you're following appropriate treatment of the data. So I see Megan asked the question about that we mentioned a literature review, and can I speak to the literature review process? And so what we did was we had the different working group members collect their different, go out and do a literature search and come back to the working group and present on what they found. And so we've got a shared Google Drive folder with the results of that analysis. And so then that resulted in some of the citations, some of the references that we made in our report. And so say that you can join the working group and see some of the internal notes that we've made on the different literature that we did as part of that review, but also in the reports themselves, we've got the citations. And so here's where we looked again at the attributes, and could we revise the attributes of trustworthy data based on some of the comments from the survey and some more discussion in the working group. And so we still have integrity and reproducibility right at the top. Those had over 70% agreement in the survey responses. We reworded methodology to be accepted techniques of creation to try and make that a bit clearer. And also provenance, we recharacterized as authenticity. To cover some of the write-in responses around data confidentiality, data encryption, we included confidentiality and authorization attributes. So the data is accessible to authorized users, and that the data is being protected and kept confidential, especially when it has compliance requirements or it includes sensitive data. And also, we had some input in the survey responses about the accessibility of data, and also that's included in the FAIR data principles, having the data be accessible, and so we included that attribute. And then reputation and responsible stewardship, we recharacterized as credible source and stewardship, so that includes the source of the data, the owner of the data. And so for the 4 stakeholders, we wanted to do an analysis of the different, how those attributes are important to those different stakeholders. So a data user wants to ensure that the data that they use is available, has integrity, it's authentic, it was created in a proven manner, and it's accessed appropriately. The data provider wants to ensure that the data is protected but made accessible as appropriate, and potentially that they have the ability to vet and grant approval to that data. The secure infrastructure provider wants to support the data provider's policies and satisfy the data users in their need for trustworthy data, for access to data and understanding the trustworthiness of the data that they use. And then the facilitation and compliance professionals want to make sure that the users of the system, all the parties in the system, are getting access to the data in an appropriate way, complying with the appropriate policies, and providing the trustworthy attributes. And so zooming in just on, so we provide this in a table in the report, but I want to just zoom in on the column of the table that's about secure infrastructure providers, again, because I was thinking that might be the best fit for Science Gateway operators. And so of the availability attribute is, of course, important for infrastructure and a gateway, providing secure and timely access to the data. For integrity, have an infrastructure that can maintain the integrity of data, protecting it from alteration, corruption, loss. Authenticity means that your infrastructure is ensuring that the data that it's providing is what was originally provided, that was originally uploaded and stored in the infrastructure, and that its provenance can be verified. And then accepted techniques of creation is about allowing data owners to document the means of creation when they store the data, because that's how that authenticity can be verified. Authorization relies on access controls that implement the data provider's policies. Confidentiality is about encryption and other tools for maintaining confidentiality of sensitive data and other data that needs to be protected. Credibility is about protecting the data from misuse. And reproducibility is protecting the data from transformations that would result in different scientific results later. So, so that could be, so that's an example. I mentioned the example of, if you're changing the software that is used to produce the data, making sure that it's still producing consistent scientific results. And so in our analysis of the different tools and technologies and how they relate to these attributes of trustworthy data, we found actually that that the tools really fit the availability, integrity, and authorization attributes fairly well. So thinking of necessary tools, maintaining the availability, integrity, and of your data. You need to have network controls and security protections and access controls, because you don't want somebody maliciously deleting the data, for example, or maliciously modifying the data. But for the other attributes like authenticity and accepted techniques of creation, we have less of those tools that are helping us with those attributes. And so that's an aspect where we're interested in more community input on tools that can help with those attributes. And so as summarized on this slide, we did review in our report some methods for managing accepted techniques of creation and reproducibility, like using containers for managing the environment that your data is produced in, and supporting reproducibility through scientific notebooks, and then being transparent about the techniques that were used to create that data, publishing the source code, providing metadata about the data. For the confidentiality aspects in our report, we talk about encryption and access controls, and also managing sensitive data through de-identification or differential privacy, so that you can provide access to personally identifying data, for example, with in a way that does not violate the privacy of the individuals in that data. And then for authenticity and credible source and stewardship, we can think about cryptographic hashes on the data, digital signatures on the data, and other methods like that. So if we're using all these tools to manage the trustworthiness of our data, it's important to communicate that trustworthiness to the users of the data. And so documenting the provenance of the data, being transparent about the policies under which that data was created and managed, can be two attributes that are really key for communicating the trustworthiness of the data that we talk about in our report. And a third aspect that we talk about is the benefit of third-party certifications around the processes and policies of your data infrastructure. And Core Trust Seal is an example that we highlight in the report that has some nice attributes of how your data is managed in a trustworthy way. And so I just want to highlight a few of the items of related work that we include in our report. there's more in the report, but the trust principles for digital repositories and risk assessment for scientific data was really valuable input to our report. We also looked at the FAIR principles and the criteria, the Core Trust Seal Data Repository certification. And then here's the link to the integrity protection for scientific workflow data that's associated with the Pegasus project. And so before I jump into some questions about trustworthy data and science gateways, let me pause and see any other questions about the topics covered in our guidance report, or any other questions or comments or input on that.
Hi, Jim. I was wondering if you can go back to that one matrix slide that you had.
This one?
I just wanted to take a look at this a little again.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is it safe to assume that this is coming right out of the report? So if people, or the draft report,
Right.
so they can check it out then there too.
That's
Yeah,
right.
And we can provide, I think if we didn't already in the abstract provide a link to the draft report, we could certainly provide that when we post the video and slides from this as well.
Okay, thank you.
And this analysis was conducted by the working group members, but I'm certainly happy to receive some additional input on it that we could include in a revision to the report.
So how are the symbols? I assume these are ratings that you guys did, the sufficient, necessary, and optional. Is that right?
Right. And so basically the methodology here was we had a working group, a subgroup of the working group that went off and debated each of these rows and columns in the table to come at these results. And then there's some explanation for how it came by those values in the table. That explanation is provided in the report.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I look forward to reading some more about this.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, others are welcome to chime in if they have questions. You don't have to necessarily put it in chat, or if you have comments. We're a small enough group that you could certainly just speak up if you have something you want to ask or say.
And I'm going to put up some questions of my own, but I'm also happy to go back to these other to the other slides as well, to if you have any questions or comments on the other material. But so I wonder what you all think about this topic of trustworthy data and science gateways. So those attributes of trustworthiness, do they match what your science gateway users expect, or are there other attributes that we should be looking at? That list of tools and technologies, do they match the capabilities for managing trustworthiness that science gateways are currently providing, or that you might plan to provide in the future? Are there ways that science gateways communicate trustworthiness of the data that they manage that you'd like to share with us today, or that we can include in the report? And I guess what's working well? What attributes of trustworthiness are handled well by your science gateways? And are there any attributes of trustworthiness that you're finding difficult to achieve, and maybe the working group could do some more research and provide some more guidance in those areas? Any thoughts on any of those questions?
I'm not a data person, so I don't have a comment directly related to that, but I'm curious in terms of the input. Obviously, you've gotten input from the survey from many different types of people, and your working group is very diverse as well. But because I don't know most of the people in the working group, I'm curious as to whether, there's various groups that are very preoccupied with just data in general, and I'm wondering how much you specifically reached out to or engaged with groups like RDA, for example, or you know, there's folks who are building gateways that are around reproducibility, or you know, those some of those kinds of topics. And I wondered, you know, I can't necessarily tell you off the top of my head what they're called. I just know that I see them again and again showing it, you know, presenting at conferences and so forth. So I just wondered how much you dove into reaching out to those kinds of communities.
We did talk to some folks from RDA, and at least one of those I think it was the trust principles, or I think it was the risk assessment for scientific data came out of a work that RDA was involved in. Maybe one of the working group members can correct me in the chat if I got that wrong, but so we did get some input on the RDA side. I'm really intrigued by the science gateways that are focused on reproducibility. So that's new to me, and that could be something for the working group to learn more about as we're revising our report. That could be really good input for us.
Sure. Yeah, I know that I can. We could dig up who some of those what some of those projects are, based on people who presented at past conferences, and yeah, I just have to look around and figure it out, because I know some of them have names that I would recognize if I just look through for you. Sure. So if you remind me, I'll do that.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And Megan's provided us a great reference in the chat to biocomputeobject.org that has workflow documentation infrastructure developers. That's great. We'll follow up on that.
So there's a comment here also from Anne that just popped in. She says, I work with people in the social sciences and education, and I'm not sure this is on their active radar. I think some education on this topic for those users would be helpful, and this report could be a good start.
Right, and so we have been thinking about how we didn't get a lot of responses to the survey from people working in social sciences and education, and so it's a bit of a blind spot in the survey analysis, but I think sharing our report with those communities and finding ways to do some outreach there, I think could be really valuable.
And you know that I come from social sciences, and you know, I don't actively do research in that area, but I know that certainly one of the criticisms in general, because so much of it is either experimental or behavioral surveys where, you know, there's all sorts of biased behavior, and as people try to, you know, I mean, it's known that people give answers that are more like what they wish they felt or what they want people to think they do, even though it might be anonymous. So there's, you know, there's all sorts of questions and concerns sometimes about even the reproducibility of such data, and a lot of it is very small too. So as far as, you know, in terms of security aspects, or like, this is how this data should be guarded, you know, I know certainly as part of my graduate training, I mean, it was before things were widely stored in clouds and so forth, but mainly it was the IRB, Institutional Review Board, that was keeping an eye on whether we were being careful, and, you know, was any personally identifiable data kept in a locked filing cabinet, for example. You know, that was the way it worked back then. But I would say my sense is certainly there are more and more people working in big data in social sciences, but there, you know, there's certainly a predominant number who are doing small amounts that just live on their laptops. So then the question is just really kind of also in terms of cybersecurity, it's just personal hacking and making sure you keep your computer safe. So it is kind of, I would totally agree. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I would agree with what Anne said, in that it's not on the radar, you know, the kinds of people, and certainly in some of the communities that I've been exposed to. So I see also another question from Megan. If you want to, I don't know if you want to read it, if you'd like me to.
Okay, I can read this one. So Megan says, I'm wondering if terminology might be part of the issue for connecting with this group as well. Many social scientists work with data repositories instead of science gateways, for example.
can, sorry, I
Oh yeah, great.
keep typing, but I can elaborate. So I'm just thinking of, I work with a number of social science scientists working with and reusing and sharing data, but they're working with, you know, they're getting data from things like iPads or the Odom Institute, and then they're sharing their data back with places like ICPSR, if you're familiar, or putting things in the Harvard Dataverse, for example. And so they're working, I think because of that, you know, relatively smaller data sets and that sort of thing, they're not necessarily working with data that have sort of an underlying metadata structure that allows it to be very easily interoperable and therefore presented in sort of a gateways, well, the way some gateways tend to work. And so it feels like a lot of the underpinnings just work functionally differently, in addition to that communication and outreach that Anne mentioned.
And but they're uploading the data in some cases to data repositories that, and so do those data repositories provide any requirements around metadata or other policies about working with the data? And so like Core Trust Seal was the first example of a data policy standard that I learned about as part of the working group this year.
Yeah, absolutely. You can look at the Core Trust Seal kind of came from those two different ones. You may have run into that. And so there are still some repositories that are using one of the older models, but for example, ICPSR does mediated deposit, and so you do have to have certain things in place, but then they will actually do some of that curation like on their end, but there's a fee associated with that. And so whereas there are other repositories that you do have to meet a certain criteria. There may be people on the call as well who can speak to this. But yeah,
Great.
there are often certain standards in place, and then it just depends a lot on the repository in question.
Okay, good, that makes sense. Well, I'm watching the clock. I want to make sure before we run out of time to show that URL again, so you can visit trustedci.org/trustworthydata to find our reports, and you can join our email list. And if you think of any comments to send after today, I'm really interested in receiving your comments on the email list, or you can send comments directly to me. And our goal is to wrap up the working group at the end of the year. And so we'll be producing a revised report sometime in December, incorporating all the feedback that we received today and that we receive throughout the month. So I'm really interested in getting more comments. And let me also make sure that I send my thanks to all the other working group members, the people who responded to the survey, including Science Gateway folks, and to all of our funders that funded our participation in the working group.
It is quite a sizable endeavor, I must say. I mean, it really is impressive. And I appreciate your thoroughness in describing your methods too, of going, you know, how you went about picking all these people, and you know, who you reached out to and what kinds of responses you got and so forth, because it really helps clarify the thought that was, you know, that was very carefully applied to making this happen. So
great, thanks. And if our website is down at the moment, I don't know if we're having an outage from our web provider, which is Squarespace right now. So, but sorry about that. Please do check back. It's usually up.
Yeah, and you know, people are welcome to post additional questions. I'm gonna just share while you're thinking, in case you do want to think for a moment. I'm going to share my screen just to tell you a little bit. Hopefully, it's showing. To tell you a little bit about what's coming next month, and because it may also interest some of you. We have Hiram Kuykendall he is at a company called MicroAssist, and they basically come in and intervene when people have discovered that they're violating compliance issues around accessibility, which is particularly concerned for things that are federally funded. And he said many people don't really have that on their radar. So it's important, but under recognized, and it kind of is often lumped in with usability, but he'll be speaking about providing accessibility in your gateway, and a kind of a checklist or tool or something that his organization uses to help organizations that are producing software make sure that they are complying with all these different kinds of regulations. So with that, I think I'm looking at our list. There's someone who responded in with a link to the URL, a different link to the URL for your report, but it certainly looks like we have a bunch of happy folks. So I'll just see if anyone wants to speak up. You're certainly welcome to. You don't necessarily have to put your questions in the comments. You could, in chat rather, you can just speak up if you want to say anything. Mona, did you want to say something?
No, thank you.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I just saw you were unmuted. So, all right. Well, with that, then I will thank you, Jim, for doing a great job covering all of this content. This is really interesting to hear about, and I think it'll be really valuable for the folks in our community to know more about what to be keeping in mind and what the implications are for what you've learned. So I'll let everyone get an extra couple minutes in their day before they head on to their next appointment.
Okay.
So thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Jim.